Good afternoon and welcome to the next session of the day, the local impact of voting theory. Our presenters today are Professor Max Aeschbacher and Professor John Anderson from Utah Valley University. If you have any questions for our presenters during the session, please feel free to enter those into the chat at the bottom of the Zoom screen and we will address them at the end of the talk. And on that note, I will hand it over to our presenters.
Thank you. Let me just get my screen sharing up and going. We are very excited to be with you today. This is a topic that Max and I have gone back almost 6 years now, probably a little bit more than that. Something that we've taken very seriously, and we're excited to be able to share this with you today. Actually, this is the right one. I'm not sure why it's not getting the right slide up next, but yeah, I have a slide that I just want to spend just a minute on. I'm not sure why it's not presenting correctly, but I just want to introduce you to Utah Valley University. We are a regional state university in the state of Utah. I don't know, everything's going all sorts of crazy.
I can talk while you find that if you want.
Yeah, if you just want to.
Yeah, we're a regional state university. We're the largest university in Utah. We teach a population of approximately 40,000 students. And we have a sort of dual mission, including a community college mission. And that's a big part of where John and I come in. We teach for a department called the Department of Developmental Mathematics. We teach everything from arithmetic all the way up through the basic non-science major quantitative reasoning course. And that's where sort of voting theory comes into this. Like John said, we've been teaching and studying voting theory for years now, but this talk and some of the ideas behind it were born out of a grant that we received called the Leadership and Civic Thought grant, and we want to develop some voting theory curriculum to teach voting theory to students in a way that is more meaningful given the locality of Utah County and Utah at large. And we suspect that most of you are not living in Utah, which is fine. It means that some of our examples might be a little bit less meaningful to you, but it could give you some ideas about how you could go about finding local examples to appeal to your students. Okay, so like John said, we started teaching this right around the 2016 presidential primary, which is a pretty exciting and very heavily covered in the news election, which led to one of our more controversial presidential candidates and presidents. And what we noticed when we talked about different voting methods was students, first of all, tend to have a very poor understanding of how voting works. And this was highly concerning because when you release college students out into the population to become stewards of their community, you want them to know how their leadership is elected, and you want them to engage civically and participate in the process of electing governments and leadership, and maybe even running for government, And what we saw is that the current voting system that we use in presidential elections in this country, and honestly most elections across the country, is the system of plurality, and that tends to do a poor job of capturing the will of the voters. Now, I'm not going to make blanket statements about whether or not the right thing happened, but I think we have two really good examples, and one of them sort of lands in the Republican primary and one of them lands in the Democratic primary, so we're not trying to take a partisan stance here. But if you look at the Super Tuesday results, which we have posted here for the presidential primary in 2016, that field started with 17 candidates. By the time we got to voting, we were down to 12, and they're pictured there for you on the left side of the screen. And you can see that in the aggregate Super Tuesday results, Donald Trump won a plurality of the vote, but it was only a 35% plurality. The rest of the candidates comprise a majority among them. And we'll get into ranked choice voting, but I paid a lot of attention to the news while this election was going on, and it really seemed like the polling suggested that the average voter who was not voting for Trump might have ranked Trump pretty low on a preference ballot. So
it's also important.
Let's move on to the next.
It's also important to recognize that in the first primary in Iowa, Cruz had the plurality as well. So at the very beginning, it wasn't Trump who had a plurality moving forward.
Right. Okay, so on to the Democratic primary from 2020, which started with even more candidates. We started with 20 candidates in the Democratic primary, and we did, let's see, we whittled down to 11 by the time voting started. We don't have aggregate Super Tuesday data for you here, but we pulled some states of interest. Let's see, so Utah was of interest to us because it was Utah. And you can see that Bernie Sanders has a commanding lead among Utah voters. Again, it's only a 36% plurality, but it's way more votes than second place Joe Biden. Bernie Sanders also had quite a lead over Joe Biden in California, but this wasn't true in every state. And in particular, it appears that the more red the state, the more likely Joe Biden was to do well, although Utah was sort of an exception to that. Nonetheless, it's interesting to think about who these candidates were and what they were talking about. So Joe Biden was very much a centrist Democrat, and we had much more progressive candidates, social Democrats like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who were arguing for more progressive policies. And while a voter who might have ranked Bernie Sanders first probably would put Elizabeth Warren second and various other candidates third and fourth, and Joe Biden might appear toward the bottom of that ticket. Likewise, voters who prefer Joe Biden might be ranking Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren much lower down on the ticket in favor of candidates like Amy Klobuchar or Michael Bloomberg. So I think these are two examples where it really kind of shows that plurality doesn't give us the whole picture. It's very much in some sense fair that it tells us who the most people voted for. It really does do that, but it doesn't give us a really clear picture of what the entire voting population is thinking.
So with that, we're going to move into talking about what's happened here in Utah. And this is what we'd encourage. If you want to teach this, get into Virginia, look at your local areas, look at your state governments and do the same thing. And in 2020, for our Republican primary gubernatorial process, it turned out that there were about 7 candidates that were running. And when that happens in our primaries in the state of Utah, we immediately use ranked choice voting to try and whittle that down so that the candidate that best represents the Republican Party is the one that goes on to the ticket. This happens in both primaries that occur in our state, but it was really interesting to see with the 7 that came out, they ended up using ranked choice, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. But that's one of the big places that we saw it used recently for us, was in selecting who was going to be the Republican candidate on the ballot.
So for the record, they use plurality in the popular election. That is collecting votes from voters. If someone gets, what was the threshold, 60% of the popular vote at that stage, they just automatically win. If a candidate does not get 60% of the vote, then it goes to a ranked choice runoff at the caucus, and it happens at the caucus level. And in Utah, the Republican primary might as well be the general election, because it's been quite some time since Utah has had a Democratic governor, and I don't see that happening again anytime soon. So the candidate who wins the Republican primary is presumptive at that point.
Thank you. Moving forward, ranked choice is becoming more and more an option in our state. In particular, in 2018, the legislature passed a bill that allows municipalities to use ranked choice voting for all of their elections for their positions in that municipality, for the mayor, for the council members, even for our school boards. And here we have a list since 2018 of the cities that have chosen to use ranked choice voting. And every year this list continues to grow quite a bit larger and larger. And this is something else that is worth pointing out to your students, is what's happening around them. Where are they living, what's happening, and how they can be a part of moving this conversation forward. And so,
and this information is not, it doesn't come at you. You don't tend to see this stuff in the news. This happened while I wasn't even looking. I mean, I was teaching and studying voting theory, and I honestly had no idea until I dug into it myself that it was happening so widely in Utah at municipal levels. Okay, so a quick word about ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting in an academic setting is the umbrella term that refers to any voting system where you take a ballot and rank the candidates in order of your preference. And this is what we're arguing that voters should be granted the ability to do. The interesting mathematical question then comes, okay, how do you take this information and analyze it to produce a winner for the election? And we'll go through several examples of that. And there are some different choices, and there are pros and cons to a lot of these different choices. We'll get into that too. But there's a discrepancy that you're going to want to look out for. And we're going to be guilty of it ourselves in this talk. The term ranked choice voting, even though it is really the umbrella term, often gets used as a matter of convenience to refer specifically to one kind of ranked choice voting, and that is instant runoff voting, also known as plurality with elimination, which is the method that they use, is probably the most widely used ranked choice method in the United States, and it's certainly what they used in the Republican caucus to elect the governor.
And very specifically, the reason that we're using this language, even though both of us think that we should potentially change it to either plurality with elimination or instant runoff, is because when you see news articles that refer to ranked choice voting, this is what they're referring to, is the instant runoff. So when you're looking at news articles from MSNBC, from CNN, or any of those publishers, when they refer to ranked choice voting, this is what they're referring to, including in our state laws that allow the municipalities to do it. They also refer to it as ranked choice voting there. So what we'd like to do just briefly is to go back to the gubernatorial primary and caucus votes. And so these were the votes cast in the caucus. And you can see the candidates listed on the left, how many people voted for them as their first pick choice, because we always go off of with who's left on your ballot, who's highest on it. And since it's the first round, then that's their first pick. And what you do is you look down and you rank these and you count up how many votes there are. And if someone has, when you're at the instant runoff point, if someone has more than majority, more than 50%, they're the winner. And you keep going until that happens. And so you keep reanalyzing it. But if no one can be declared the winner, Cox Henderson, you can see, is at 30.2% on the first round. That's not enough to win. He only has a plurality, not a majority. Then you eliminate the lowest person, the person with the fewest first place votes, and that would be Christensen Chamberlain. But you have to take their votes and you have to move them so that they go to the appropriate places. So in this case, 2 people said, you know what, this is our only choice. We're not putting anyone else down. 17 went to Birmingham, 5 went to Wright, 8 went to Newton, 11 went to Hughes, and Cox got one of those 44 votes. So you take those votes, you look at their ballots in particular, and you figure out who their second choice is, and that becomes their new first choice. And of course, as you can see the percents, it did change. The 1.2 did go out, but no one crossed that important threshold of 50%. So we repeat the process, and Huntsman and Kafasi are now eliminated, and their 315 votes are redistributed to the remaining candidates, including those who go into the inactive ballots, who only listed a couple of people, one, maybe two people. In this case, there were 12 more people who didn't put anyone but Huntsman on. No one wins again, so we go to the next round and we split these 530 up. And now you're starting to see the percentages as we get into it, as more and more people are needing to go to a new place to vote. You can see that the 530 split, Cox is now up to 36%. When Wright, Bishop are removed, you can see that those percentages are going up. Eventually, Newton and Dougal are, their 918 gets split. And at this point, Cox now has 55% of the remaining vote. And so Cox is declared to be the winner of this instant runoff. And again, the reason you want to do this in one ballot is it saves having to have people come in and revote and revote and revote as you whittle down the field. That by doing it with a single ballot and running this analysis, it's almost as if you were running several elections back to back.
And John said something that I think is really important to emphasize here. We make a mathematical assumption when we do this, that if someone ranks a candidate second place, as soon as their first choice is eliminated, their second choice becomes their first choice. Everything just slides up a row. And I think that's a very safe mathematical and philosophical assumption to make. Okay, so no discussion of voting theory is complete without a discussion of Arrow's impossibility theorem. Economist Kenneth Arrow, back in 1950, published his seminal paper on the subject, A Difficulty in the Concept of Social Welfare, where he, excuse me, he outlined several criteria for fairness in the realm of voting, and then proceeded to prove that there could not exist a voting system that would satisfy all of them at the same time. And the spiel I give my students when I talk about this is when they start to understand, oh no, there's no way to be completely fair. That seems like a hopeless moment, but I think out of that hope, or out of that hopelessness actually comes hope, because it allows us to look and focus at what fairness criteria we care about the most, and then aim our method of voting at satisfying those. Now, a word about the word fairness. Strictly speaking, all of these methods are fair, and any method is fair as long as it is uniformly applied to the entire population. What Arrow meant by fairness when he defined these criteria was almost more akin to justice. What does a good job of capturing the will of the voters? So just I'll briefly summarize all of these. The majority criterion says if there is a majority candidate, if someone got more than 50% of the vote, that person should be the winner. If a majority prefers a candidate to everyone else, they should be the winner. That is a majority of first place votes. The Condorcet criterion is similar, but a little bit different. It says if you take every candidate, match them pairwise with every other candidate, and find that there's a candidate that wins all of these pairwise comparisons, then that candidate should be the winner. Monotonicity says that no candidate should lose an election by moving up on someone's ballot. That is, ranking someone higher on a subset of the ballot should never turn a winner into a loser. And believe it or not, that can actually happen with instant runoff. Independence of irrelevant alternatives is somewhat similar to monotonicity. It says that if a losing candidate drops out of an election, which could happen for a number of reasons. It could be they were deemed ineligible. It could be that they got sick. It could be they just decided to quit. The process of someone dropping out should not turn a winner into a loser if it wasn't, the person dropping out. And the dictator criterion is simple. It just simply says that there should never be an election system where one person gets to decide the outcome. There should be no dictator. Yeah, so Arrow proved that you can never have a system that satisfies all of those at the same time.
And just as the case of point with the instant runoff, that again is the most commonly used form of ranked choice voting that shows up in the media and at different places. Because of the way it's built, it can never violate the majority criteria, because as soon as someone has a majority, it's done. But all of the other three, with the exception of the dictator criteria, that one usually doesn't show up when you're listing these, just because it's pretty straightforward and none of the methods allow it in the first place that we talk about. But the Condorcet criteria, it's perfectly possible that when you go from 2 people to 3 people, the way that they rank may turn that person who would have won in any given pairwise comparison, he no longer wins because of the way that the instant runoff moves votes around from people. Same thing with the monotonicity. If people start voting strategically and say, hey, I'm going to rank this person a little bit higher than that person, it actually can cause the person they really want to lose the election. It could actually cause both people to lose the election, the one they want and the one that they moved, in such a way that it can cause problems. And it's very susceptible to if people drop out of the running or removed from the voting process while it's happening as well. And so just to show how those criteria fit in here, we always talk about this with our students, but a really important thing to remember is that just because it can violate a particular criteria doesn't mean that it always will. And so that can be useful to analyze what situations cause those criteria to be violated, to see to what extent you think it's liable to happen.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I read a paper recently. The author's name escapes me, but he argued vigorously that the Condorcet criteria was the most important of the criteria, and he further argued that it's the least likely to be violated under certain methods. So.
Right. So with that, we just want to point out that there are other voting methods, most of which will use some form of ranked order ballots. Plurality is just simply whoever has the most wins. This one very rarely, if ever, uses ranked order, because you just look at the first place votes and whoever has the most, that's all it takes. They win. The next one up is the board account method, which assigns points to each ballot based on how highly ranked they are. So the highest ranked person would get the most points. And it typically is the number of people on the ballot, and then it decreases by 1 as it goes. And so you get this very linear count of figuring out how to award points, and you build up a point system with the board account method. The pairwise comparison goes through and looks at every possible pairing out there and determines who would win each of those, and then compares the ones who win the most of those and considers them the winner. So it takes that opportunity, kind of treats it as a round robin, and takes the time to go through and look at all those comparisons to determine who would win. And these are the 3 that most textbooks out there, if they're going to talk about voting theory, the 4 that they're going to talk about are the 4 that we have here: the instant runoff, plurality, board account, and pairwise comparison. But there are a few others out there. For instance, in Alaska this year, they're actually using what is referred to as a jungle primary, or a nonpartisan top 4 primary, where they collect all the votes from the primary, and whoever has the 4 most votes, those are the candidates in the general election, which is then decided using the instant runoff method. So this is one that we've recently found and haven't had a lot of chance to analyze, but looks pretty interesting from a fairness perspective.
It looks highly problematic from a fairness perspective, at least from if you consider fairness to be capturing the the true intent and will of the voting population. In particular, suppose, for the sake of argument, so Alaska tends to be a pretty conservative state, which means they probably should be electing a conservative candidate. But this kind of system is ripe for a liberal candidate to swoop in and win with a plurality. In particular, if we just say, okay, here's a pile of candidates, go vote, and we'll take the top 4 numbers that we see, put them all into a general election, and then see who wins. You could easily end up with 3 conservative candidates and one liberal candidate. That one liberal candidate might get 40% of the vote, while the 3 conservative candidates are splitting the vote amongst themselves. And again, not to take a partisan stance on it, but a conservative population probably should be electing a conservative winner. And I don't know that we've done a proper job of capturing the will of the voters if we do it this way.
So the jungle primary definitely suffers from that, but they follow it up with a ranked choice vote. Theoretically,
that does help.
But there still are potential problems.
Yeah, if you're doing ranked choice in the top 4, that does.
Which
that
is the
does
way
help.
Alaska has set it up.
Yeah, that's good.
So this one's yours, Max.
Okay, so approval voting is mathematically interesting and probably incorrect to do in real life. Approval voting is the notion of you just look at a list of candidates and just put a checkbox next to anyone that you approve of. So you can kind of vote for as many or as few as you want to. And each such checkbox translates into a vote, and then we count them all up and say who got the most. The biggest problem that I see with approval voting is that majority is no longer unique. So you can still talk about who got the most votes, but you could have someone who had 70% approval, and you could have someone who had 60% approval. And maybe the person who had 70% approval is better, but we still had majority approval with someone else. And I don't know. I'm not sure about approval voting in general. It's interesting, but I don't think it's correct.
It almost works better if you're trying to figure out where a group of friends want to go and eat, and low stake things like that, rather than public officials.
That's a good point. I often get too wrapped up in the political aspect of voting theory, and I forget that voting is used in lots of situations that are not political. Like, where do we want to go to dinner? Now approval voting is highly appropriate because we just want to figure out, where do people approve of? This could be relevant in other situations, like even smaller elections, like the president of a faculty senate, or even like a department chair or something like that, where you want to get a sense of who the voting population is willing to work for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, cumulative voting is a method of voting that could potentially limit or eliminate the negative impacts of gerrymandering. And it goes like this. I'll use Utah as an example because we're in Utah. Utah has 4 congresspeople. And do we have the map on the next slide?
It's on the next
John?
slide, yep.
Yeah, go ahead and flip the slide and I'll just show it. So here are the 4 districts of Utah. I live on the east bench of Salt Lake City, sort of on the very top right portion of the orange section. Yeah, John's got me there. So I'm about right there. My district includes all the way down to the lower left corner of the state where St. George is. And I just am not entirely convinced that my interests as a voter have anything to do with St. George and their interests as voters. So how these maps are drawn and written can have lots of effects. They can disenfranchise voting communities, and there's a big controversy about this nationwide. But if instead we were to vote by cumulative voting, it would work like this. We'd say, okay, we have so many people running for Congress in Utah with 4 positions available. Everyone gets, say, 4 votes, and you can assign them to whoever you want. You can assign all 4 votes to one candidate. You could assign 1 vote to 4 different candidates, or you could split them up 2 and 2 or 3 and 1. It's your choice. And anyone in the state is voting for all of Congress for the state. And now disenfranchisement is less of an issue. So that's a very interesting voting idea, which could address this issue. So, okay, so I see your comment in the chat, Pamela. You say approval followed by ranked choice plurality runoff, like plurality with elimination. And you use approval of 50% or more to get to the next level. Okay, now let's see. That is an interesting idea.
Yeah, I just see it as
but I don't think there's a guarantee that you end up with a.
Go ahead, Pamela.
Go ahead.
I just see it as more of a, I wouldn't want to have to rank 12 plus people. Ranking 5 or 6 people, fine, but if there's a whole bunch of people, I wouldn't want to have to rank that many people.
Okay, so thank you for bringing this up. This is a really important point. If you have an election with lots of candidates on it, that can be overwhelming to voters. And the solution to this that I would recommend is don't rank all of them. Simply rank your top 5 or your top 3.
That's true too. Yeah.
And we could organize the vote this way. There could just be 5 slots and say, put your top 5 candidates in here. But one place where we must take great care in this process is to not make it too complicated. The faith in our election system nationwide is kind of at an all-time low right now. And part of my passion behind teaching voting theory comes from a place of wanting people to understand how our government is elected so that they will have faith in that process. And maybe even encourage them to go be part of that process, even more than just a voter. Go collect or certify ballots, go help count the vote. But it is also clear to me that voting is a burden for most people. Most people don't get excited about it like I do. They don't wake up and say, it's voting day, I get to vote. They wake up and say, I'll get around to it if I feel like it, and then maybe they don't. And the more complexity you feather into a system, even if that works toward making that system like mathematically perfect and fair, it could be a victim of itself when the voters don't want to get on board anymore. So,
which is the same
these
thing.
are the things that we have to grapple with.
Yeah, and it's the same thing that you're pointing out, Pamela, and not wanting to rank 12 people. A good example of that is the Heisman Trophy is actually done with some ranked choice voting as well. And technically every college football player is eligible for the Heisman. And you only vote for your top 3 to 5, I think it's 5 of them, which is why it tends to cluster around quarterbacks and running backs that have a spectacular season and things like that, because they're well known across the board as opposed to linemen. So, but yeah, it's definitely a concern of how many you rank as well. And we should have mentioned that earlier. Most instant runoffs only have you rank between 3 to 5, regardless of the number of candidates.
Yeah. If you get into teaching voting theory, there are some very sort of natural stretch topics. When you get to the end of talking about the voting methods and then discussing fairness, I'm always hungry to keep going as a teacher. Depending on the semester, sometimes my students are hungry for more as well. Weighted voting systems are a great way to talk about that. Weighted voting systems sort of address how one might vote when the different voters in the system control different numbers of votes. And this is especially important on, say, an executive board of a company, where the board members control different amounts of shares and therefore different numbers of votes. Gerrymandering, we already talked about a little bit. That's a sort of down the road impact of voting that is definitely worth talking about. And one of my absolute favorites is apportionment. Apportionment, especially the apportionment of the United States Congress, was thought of by the founding fathers as a simple math problem that would be easy to work out. and it was written into the Constitution under that assumption. And it turns out to be a very nuanced and problematic math problem that is difficult to work out. And we spent over a century as a country fighting about it. We seem to have settled now on a more or less permanent solution to the apportionment of Congress. But the evolution of how we got there is very interesting, not just from a mathematical perspective, but from a historical perspective.
Yeah.
And teaching this gives you fun opportunities in class to talk about history. You can talk about slavery and the impacts of things like the 3/5 Compromise. You can show clips from Hamilton, which gets a lot of students excited. And yeah, so I really love teaching apportionment.
So we're going to transition just a little bit because we've been teaching this, like we've mentioned, for a few years now, really started back in 2016. And since that time, we've actually seen this impact directly at UVU. Our student body elections used to be run on plurality. And I had a former student who was an officer, and when they were getting ready to step down and turn over for the next year, they proposed going with the ranked choice voting system, which was very quickly adopted. And in fact, it was used quite a bit. Almost every position in our most recent student body elections had 3 or more candidates. I think there was only 2 of the 7 of them that had 2. And in all of them, they used ranked choice voting, instant runoff to determine the winner. And it's made a big impact. And so you can see here, they actually go out of their way on the website. I pulled this right from the website for this year. And you can see that they've listed right there exactly how the elections are going to be done with the method, and they explain it to the students so the students have an idea of what's happening. We've also seen them used in our faculty senate elections. We are using ranked voting when we run into situations where we have multiple people, more than 2 people running for a position. And we're seeing a number of informed voters. That slide that I shared earlier about the number of municipalities that are using ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting to select their officers has been growing more and more. And we'd like to think that we're a part of that with informing our students about what's happening and what's going on. And so we're seeing this already just in the time that we've been here. We're seeing what we're teaching having an impact.
So our biggest goal with this grant is to develop some curriculum that we can get out to other faculty who might be interested in teaching voting theory, especially at UVU, but even around Utah. And one of the things you find when you teach voting theory is that examples are tricky to come by. And the Hawks book that we teach out of is called Viewing Life Mathematically, which just came out with a new edition. Has some great examples in it, but I'm always kind of hungry for more. And that leaves us wanting to write our own, or, spend a lot of time scouring the internet for good real life examples. And so one of our sort of stretch goals with the grant, assuming we can get it done in time, is to do some coding and write some software that could be used by teachers to create examples. And specifically, I need an example of a board account election that violates the majority criterion. Or I needed an example of a plurality with elimination that violates monotonicity. And it would be very nice to have a web utility that would be able to just generate those examples on the fly. You could use them for tests, you could use them for projects. So that's something we have on the horizon. And we are interested in insights anyone has about how to do that, if you happen to know. And we're happy to answer any questions you have. And we're always looking for feedback and new examples about voting theory. So if you have some, please ask, or please, send us an email after the fact. And that's probably a good place to stop. So thank you all for coming and watching, and thank you to Hawks for putting this on. And thanks to Joanna for hosting us, and thank you.
All right. Well, thank you both so much for all of the information you shared. That was really fascinating. We don't have any questions in the chat right now. If anyone does want to send anything in now, feel free. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and wrap up a few minutes early for this session. We do have our final session of the day beginning at 3 p.m. Eastern. So in just a moment, I will send in the chat the links to the following sessions. But you can also check the conference website for a complete list of sessions and their descriptions. And while accessing the conference website, don't forget to swing by the virtual booth to say hello to the Hawks team, view a quick 5-minute demonstration, and be entered to win a $50 Amazon gift card. Thank you all again for joining this session. Thank you, John and Max, for that presentation again. We will have the recordings of these sessions sent out next week. So if you did want to recatch anything, that will be an option. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.